Hello and welcome to today's webinar on integrating livestock into dryland organic crop rotations by Jonathan Wachter, Lynne Carpenter-Boggs, and Kate Painter. I'd like to welcome our speakers today, Jonathan Wachter, Kate Painter, and Lynne Carpenter-Boggs. Dr. Lynne Carpenter-Boggs is an associate professor in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences at Washington State University. Her emphasis area is sustainable and organic agriculture. Much of her work focuses on the understanding and management of beneficial soil microbial communities. Dr. Kate Painter is an analyst and adjunct assistant professor in the Agricultural Economics and Rural Sociology Department at the University of Idaho. She is responsible for developing and maintaining economic models for Idaho farm and ranch operations, including cost and returns analysis for all major crops and livestock systems. Jonathan Wachter is a PhD student in soil science at Washington State University. His research is focused on understanding nutrient cycling and availability in organic mixed crop livestock systems as compared to conventionally managed wheat farms. So Jonathan will be our first speaker.
Great, thank you, Alice. So my name is Jonathan Wachter, and I'll be starting this presentation just quickly to give you an outline of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to go over some broad benefits and examples of integrating livestock and crops. And then Lynne will go over some models of integration, farm integration.
Muted.
Go over some case studies in the Palouse region in eastern Washington, which is where we're located. And then Kate will talk about some of the challenges to mixed farming and really focusing on economic trends and policies in the U.S. today. And then finally, I'll finish by describing our current research project on the Palouse. So generally speaking, there's a few categories of benefits of integrating livestock into cropping systems. So first of all, livestock lets you utilize different feed sources that otherwise you wouldn't be able to make use of. So you can graze crop residues. So in this picture you see sheep grazing wheat residues. You can graze a failed crop if you have a weed or disease problem that ruins a crop. You can still get an economic return off of that by grazing it. Or different food and processing wastes. So for example, biofuel operations with the waste products from those people feed to cattle. There are countless examples of this. So another category is livestock work. So this means more than just draft animals, but there's a lot of potential to reduce fuel use and labor. So one big example is animals can harvest their own feed. So rather than having to mow and bale and feed hay, animals can just go out and harvest their own feed. They can also distribute manure and other nutrients. So a classic example is grazing birds after ruminants, and so the birds can peck at the manure and spread the manure rather than having to go in and harrow and distribute it yourself. In this photo you see pigs clearing forested ground. So pigs are excellent at clearing ground. And there again, rather than having to go in and use a lot of fuel to clear the ground and human labor, you can set livestock out to do that. You can turn soil and also manage residues. For example, in the last photo of the sheep grazing on wheat stalks. So the next category is using livestock to increase your nutrient availability. So really by eating biomass, digesting it, and then redepositing it, you're accelerating your decomposition and nutrient release from different biomass. So this can encourage using cover crops or green manures and pasture phases in your rotation. If you're using legumes, of course, capturing that biological nitrogen fixation benefit. And research has shown that
Unmuted.
If you're grazing a legume, that you're actually returning up to 75% of the nitrogen in that above ground biomass back to the soil in the form of urine, and that's very accessible nitrogen to your crop. And so you can get a profit from grazing that green manure while also returning a significant portion of that nitrogen. and of course, by using cover crops and pastures, there's a huge increase in soil quality by building your organic matter. And then also, I just wanted to point out the role of dung beetles in grazing operations. Dung beetles play a very important role in breaking up and distributing manure down into the soil profile.
Jonathan, this is Alice. I'm really sorry to interrupt your presentation, but there have been a few people that have been complaining that it's very difficult to hear, and I've been hearing some humming noises as well, and the sound is kind of going up and down. Would it be possible for you to also call in using your telephone? Because do you have a phone there where you are?
I don't think I'll be able to do that.
You don't think you'll be able to do that?
Is this any better?
It is. Yeah, I don't know what you did, but it is a little better. So.
Okay, I'm just holding it closer to.
Oh, okay, yeah. If you could do that, that would be great, because there have been just a couple people saying that they were unable to hear you. Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. Thanks.
Okay. Yep.
So another category of benefits of integrating livestock is pest management. So here, really kind of targeting the pests and utilizing different livestock for different purposes. So poultry can be a very effective insect control. Here in this photo you see chickens grazing in a cover crop, I believe, and they can be very effective at eating insects and controlling insect pests. Ruminants have been used very effectively to alter pest and disease habitat. So this reference that I cite, Hatfield, is out in Bozeman, Montana, and they've been using ruminants on wheat stalks to control, or wheat stubble to control the wheat stem sawfly very effectively. And then again, of course, using livestock to capture the benefit of cover crops and pastures in terms of breaking disease and insect cycles. And weed management, of course, is a very big benefit of bringing livestock into crop rotation. So here again, you can really target grazing and target the types of weeds that you want to be controlling with both your grazing intensity and the type of animals that you're using. So poultry, of course, has a specific purpose as far as eating seeds and very young weeds. Geese have been used quite a bit for grazing young weeds. They seem to prefer grassy weeds. And then ruminants will be getting larger weeds. And here again, cows will tend to prefer grasses, and they can't graze nearly as close to the ground as sheep will. Sheep will prefer broadleafs, and they'll be grazing very close to the ground. And then goats tend to prefer shrubbier things, and they won't be eating quite as close to the ground. And then, of course, utilizing cover crops and pastures for weed competition, as well as grazing on those cover crops, can be a very effective strategy. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about just potential economic benefits of integrating livestock into your crop rotation. So clearly, there's the potential to diversify your income. So if crop prices are low, you can still fall back on meat or milk sales. Some studies have found an increase of total productivity and land use efficiency, and this is by over the winter you can be grazing and producing food on land that otherwise would not be producing food. Again, using unused resources, so things like wheat stubble, you can still be getting energy off of and growing, putting weight on your animals, and then finally, just giving you a lot more flexibility as far as what to sell and when to sell it, or if you want to keep it on farm. So if you have a hay operation, if you also have animals, if hay prices are down, you can use the hay on farm. But if you can get really good prices on hay, you can also sell the hay. So in this table, this was a study review by Hillemeyer. There's a link at the end of this presentation, but this just shows economic gains from integrating livestock versus not integrating those livestock. And as you can see, if done right, you can really capture on the order of several $100 per hectare in increased revenue. So with that, I will turn it over to Lynne.
Morning, everybody. My name is Lynne Carpenter-Boggs, and this next section will be about different models of crop-livestock integration and giving you a few examples. So some of the factors that I'd like to talk about are the intensive, extensiveness, ownership, and level of integration, and give you 3 examples from around Washington State. So our current agricultural model overall is actually quite high diversity, but we have very low integration. In any particular locality, we'll have a relatively lower diversity. For instance, here in the Palouse, we have 3 major grain crops and very few livestock. But overall, our agricultural U.S. system is very high diversity, hundreds of different crops and many different species of livestock. But we have extremely low integration, which means that each of the plant crops is grown and harvested, processed separately, and then, for the most part, they're fed out to different livestock. As a separate agricultural component. A high diversity crop livestock integration would mean that we also have several different plant crops, and we can have several different livestock involved. For instance, cattle and sheep can both be grazed on pasture systems, even grazing them together, which would be called multi-species grazing. And poultry can be used also on pasture or to feed on spent grains in the field and insects. So we can have within a given farm a level of integration of the crops and livestock where they're being grown in the same place. We can also have integrated systems, highly integrated systems that are still relatively low diversity. We can have very few crops, even just wheat and a pasture phase, and only 1 species of livestock, for instance, the sheep. And what's indicated here, we could also call a pretty extensive system, in that we're suggesting that sheep can graze on pasture, sheep can graze on wheat stubble, and in a crop rotation like this, you can also use the livestock essentially on the entire farm within a given year. So you could call this an extensive system because the livestock are on most of the land. The ownership of the animals is a major determinant of your options, really, but both can be very viable. So the landowner can have full ownership of the livestock. That gives the greatest opportunities for true integration and extensive use of the animals. It also means that you have to have year-round management of the animals, including their breeding and reproduction cycles. The need for infrastructure is going to be greatest, and you definitely need knowledge and skills about caring year-round for the animals, and it definitely can affect your livestock. You need to be there, or someone needs to take care of animals year-round. But integrated systems can also work even if you don't own the animals. So depending on the livestock, they can be transported between farms, and the landowner may be paid for weight gain of animals when they are brought to the otherwise just crop growing farm. There are also models where the landowner really just trades time or even pays for the livestock services for the weed and residue management that Jonathan was talking about. So models where there's low or no ownership of the animals require much less infrastructure and a lot less knowledge of the animals by the main landowner. Grazing intensity can be changed. I'm going to use the term AUM for animal unit months. So this is the primary way that land can be described for its potential to produce livestock. And you can actually go to your NRCS office and find out what the suggested AUM productivity is for any piece of land. So an animal unit month means that basically you can support the healthy growth of 2 animals for 1 month. Now you can split that up in different ways. You could also have 1 animal unit over 2 months, or 0.2 animal units over 10 months. So basically a low density but year-round or close to year-round use of the land. Alternatively, you can have a much more intensive system where you might have 16 animal units on any given piece of land for only 2 days at a time, and then you're moving them around. And although it doesn't always hold true, there are indications that well-managed, intensive, rotational, or planned grazing can actually increase your total productivity or annual animal unit month potential. And I wanted to mention about rotational or planned grazing that it doesn't mean that you need to be a cowboy anymore. When you're moving animals from an area where they've been feeding on it heavily for even a few days, they're very eager to move to the next spot. So I want to show you a few examples of systems that have worked in Washington. S&S Homestead Farm is a beautiful small-scale self-sufficient farm in western Washington, highly diversified. So they produce grains, beef, pork, lamb, vegetables, fruit, eggs, and even sell and utilize some of the animal skins. They support their own homestead and they do direct marketing. So I wanted to mention too that crop-livestock integration often works best if you're doing direct marketing. So this means that you've got vertical integration. You're utilizing the crops that you've grown to also produce livestock biomass, and then marketing both of those products. That way you gain all of the economic growth in each of those steps. So in this case, there's full ownership of the livestock and full integration over the farm. This is in a only 15-inch precipitation zone, even though it's in western Washington. And the motivation of this German-born farmer is that a penny saved is a penny earned. And he has done extensive economic models of his own farm showing that this is true. He can produce and conserve fuel, electricity, machinery, services, wages, healthcare, transportation, and the farm provides their own entertainment. Certainly animals are part of the farm entertainment. So in the case of this homestead farm, they do rotational grazing and feeding. So in the summer, the cattle do forage in a pasture, and the fences are moved incrementally across the pasture. So it's a version of rotational grazing in that the cattle are continually being exposed to a new section of the pasture. That also helps to spread out the manure. In the winter, then the cattle are fed in part of the same area, but they are supplemented with hay. In the winter, after the cattle are moved off, then that area can be planted to barley, and that fresh growth of barley helps to capture any of the available nitrogen that's been laid down from the manure. In that way, this is a great example of the nutrient cycling potential. So the crop of barley is taking up the nutrients that were laid down by the livestock. That barley then can be used by the family or the grain and straw can be fed back to the livestock. Another example very close to us and where Jonathan's research is actually happening is the Decker-Eisen partnership. This is again a diversified farm with ownership of livestock and direct marketing of the meats. One of their primary motivations is to lower the net energy use and approach sustainability in that way. Again, it is dry land, so about 20-inch precipitation zone. Several different crops are grown: wheat, peas, barley, camelina, pasture, and hay. They have poultry. You can see in the bottom here that they every year they do chickens, and sometimes they've also done turkeys, which are what are shown here. So they do a couple of different models with their livestock. The poultry tend to be grown just in a specific pasture. So that's an intensive use of one particular area. They're grazed and also fed on grains that are produced on the farm. The farm also has mules that are in their own pasture and fed hay grown on the farm. The mules also provide certain field services like harrowing and light tillage. The farm maintains milk goats. The farm utilizes the milk and makes cheese, and a very important service of the milk goats is to provide milk replacement for the lambs. I'll talk about the sheep next. That milk replacement for lambs is a very costly input that they then realize they could be producing themselves. So the milk goats are penned in their own pasture and fed hay and grain produced on the farm. But this partnership produces quite a lot of sheep. These sheep graze on the grain stubble, and they also, in the summertime, are grazed on pasture. In the winter, they're fed limited amounts of grain and hay as needed. And the third example I wanted to talk about is called Beefing Up the Palouse. This was a project that extended from about 2007 to 2012, and the idea was that we were trying to find alternatives to the CRP program, as well as just provide alternative systems for all of eastern Washington. So there's about there's over 1 million acres still in the CRP program in Washington state. CRP is allowed on areas that are highly erodible, and the landowner gets a payment for putting that land into stable grass forage mixes. So it's not cropped, and there's very limited grazing allowed either, essentially no grazing. But there have been some economic issues from CRP. The farmer doesn't necessarily need to stay on the farm in order to get those payments. So it has been argued that CRP has been a losing value for rural areas that are highly erodible. So we were taking one particular farm, GNL farm, and making it into a sustainable integrated crop livestock operation, looking for win-wins for the farmers and the environment. So 500 acres of this farm were planted into a very diverse grass and forage mix. And this is just in a 10-inch annual precipitation zone. So it can be done in very low rainfall areas. Rotational paddocks were used, and this was a high intensity rotational system. About 200 to 300 head of cattle were used over about a 90-day period. So in this case, a cattleman owned the livestock, and they were just brought in for the summertime. In this way, there was very little infrastructure that was needed, very strong perimeter fences, but otherwise you use a lot of this mobile high tensile wire that's electrified. and the landowner was just paid by how much weight gain that the cattle put on during this grazing period. So it worked quite well. We were trying to meet or beat the CRP payment to the landowner, which in that area is about $50 per acre per year. The other common alternative, or the norm in that area, is a wheat fallow system, which could pay anywhere from -$80 to +$80 per acre per year. And using this intensive rotational cattle production, in 2008, they produced enough weight gain in the cattle, about 2.5 pounds per animal per day, that the landowner got that $50 of value per acre, so equal to the CRP. And in 2009, they actually were able to up the stocking rate. There were just a couple of mistakes, though, that led to the loss of a couple of animals, which makes a big difference in your profit if you lose animals. So I wanted to point out that, again, the payment to the landowner was equal to what he would get from CRP, but that this system was also supporting a part-time cattle manager. So in a pretty low opportunity rural area, this added one full job. And the land also was producing more animal unit months than the NRCS would have estimated. And at least part of that was due to the pasture improvement and planned grazing program. So it was working pretty well, and we had grand vision for a 6 to 12 year rotation that was much more diversified, where the grazed pasture would be followed by more common crops in the area, such as wheat and lentil, and also be organic certified. So being an efficient system, but both needing and therefore supplying more labor in that area. And then some reality hit. So there are very few people in any given area that are really skilled in this level of livestock management, and basically one person got too busy to do this. So the whole thing rather fell apart. And also the landowner was seeing, all right, this is working. It's a whole lot of work for me, though, and I can always go back to CRP. So that's what the landowner decided to do. So this is an example of something that can work very well, but in the end, policy got in the way, which leads us into Kate's section on economics and policy.
Okay, so this is Kate Painter at University of Idaho, and I'm happy to participate with Jonathan and Lynn on this project. And just to summarize a little bit on some of the challenges for mixed crop muted farms. Lynn just discussed what's been going on with CRP. We do have a lot of cheap grazing in this country, though still I just wanted to make a point because I do a lot of livestock budgets as well. It's $1.35 per animal unit month. It's been that price for so long for all of our federal lands, BLM, and lots of other lands that we have that are in the public domain. So that's one reason that we still do see a lot of, there we go, okay, sorry, that we do still see a lot of livestock in this country, despite the fact that returns have not been that favorable historically. And I want to just look at historically what's been going on, and maybe it will help explain where we are today and what kind of challenges we need to overcome to have a more integrated crop and livestock system, at least on some portion of our lands. So lack of knowledge and research, labor and time intensive, and the cost of labor is very high relative to capital. I'm going to address that a little bit. Processing facilities. We don't have very many places where you can get your animals slaughtered and sell them. There's a lot of custom exempt facilities, which means you can sell someone an animal and they buy the animal from you, and then they have the animal slaughtered for their own consumption. But I couldn't sell steaks to somebody or hamburger. I have to sell them an animal. If you want to sell just small portions of an animal, kind of retail cuts, it has to be federally inspected, and there are not that many facilities left around the country where you can have that done. Okay, wintering facilities and feed, ability to finish animals. Right now we're having actually quite a crisis in our stockyards because the price of feed has been so high, the price of cattle has been so high that they cannot afford to buy the animals and fatten them and then sell them again. That will probably become a little easier as time goes on, because we've just been in the cycle where the price of beef have been at historical high and the numbers have been at historical low. And typically what happens is the market will respond, and then we will have more animals and the price will come down a bit. And feed has come down quite a bit, corn and barley. The prices have come way down from what they have been over the last few years. And we've had hay shortages as well. And hopefully we won't have as much drought and we'll have more hay supplies. The price will come down on that as well. Anyway, I am going to go on and talk about a report that I find very interesting, 20th Century Transformation of U.S. Ag and Farm Policy Report. It was written by Kathy Dimitri and others at USDA Economic Research Service. You can find that online, and I've linked to it. And I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a delay and I pressed too fast. So one thing that we all know that used to be very labor intensive around the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, that we had about 40% of the U.S. workforce employed in agriculture in 1900, and it has fallen over the years. I'm sorry, I keep clicking ahead too fast. You can see that in 1970 it was about 5%, and today it's 2% of the U.S. workforce that works in agriculture. So we have definitely have a very small number of people working as farmers and ranchers. Another change over this same period of time has been a lot more people working off farm, and I did do some research on this, particularly with respect to what farm women do. And as you can see in this graph, 1930, 1945, we had a little less than a third of farmers working 100 or more days per year. And as time's gone on, we now have 93% of farmers working off farm 100 or more days per year. So that's the vast majority. A lot of people need off farm work to have a good cash income, but even more importantly, to have benefits, health insurance, and retirement. And that was one thing that a lot of farm women do, is they need those benefits, and that's why they hold the job. They don't care about the salary so much as the benefits. So a very dramatic change has been the decline in the number of farms from, as you can see in this graph, around 6,000 from 1900, 1930, that period of time, but a dramatic drop to our current number of about 2,000 farms currently, so a 63% drop in the number of farms. And consequently, we're still farming about the same amount of land. The acres per farm has gone up an almost matching amount, 67%. I'm sorry, not a very good operator of this screen. Okay, so the average farm size in acres has gone from let's see, if you take that blue line and go straight across, a little over 100 acres per farm to now over 400, so 67% increase in average farm size over that 100-year period. But more apropos to the topic of this discussion is the number of commodities produced per farm. So there was a lot more diversity around 1900, about 5 different commodities per farm, and that number slowly declined 1930, 1945, and keep these years in mind as we talk about when some price support policies came online around 1939, I believe. Then we start seeing about 3 commodities per farm in 1970, and currently it's close to 1, just slightly over 1 commodity per farm, which is not a diverse situation. There's a lot of reasons why we've become so specialized. Oh, but I do want to just look up slightly here about how our non-metro farming dependent counties has changed during that 1950 to 2000. So I have a couple graphs here. This is 1950, and the colors look a little odd, but it looks a little blue-green, but that color is farming dependent counties. And you can see it's a predominant amount of the land in the country. And over a 50-year period of time, the non-metro farming dependent counties, there's just a little swath down the middle of the country, which has facilitated off-farm jobs for sure. Okay, and there has been some policy changes behind the scenes that have allowed farmers to become very specialized, less diverse, but still have income support for crops. Not so much for livestock, but for crops. In 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was the first farm bill, and it established the New Deal mix of commodity-specific price and income support programs. In 1936, the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act was established the first direct links between soil conservation and commodity programs. 1949 was a big year for farm policy. It established a policy of high fixed price supports and acreage allotments as permanent farm policy. And in the case of farm bills not passing through the Senate, which used to happen back then as well as today, the programs would revert to the 1949 provisions. In 1965, the Food and Ag Act introduced new income support payments in combination with reduced price supports and continued supply controls. In 1973, we had the Agricultural and Consumer Protection Act, which introduced target prices and deficiency payments to replace price supports, coupled with low commodity loan rates to increase producer reliance on markets and allow for free movement of commodities at world prices. Again, it is not really economically efficient to have these subsidies and price supports, and we like to encourage free trade, and so they were trying to move away from some of the more fixed items that we were supporting in earlier bills. Let's move on to closer to the current. 1996, Federal Ag Improvement and Reform Act replaced price support and supply control program with program of direct payments based on historical production. And then we had nearly complete planting flexibility. We had to do these things to comply with international trade programs that discouraged barriers, and so that our trading partners would accept our policies as being fair. But you can see that there was a good 50+ years of some restrictions and price supports and safety nets, all focusing on a few crops. In 2002, the Farm Security and Rural Investment Act introduced countercyclical payments triggered, so if the current prices fell below a target level, farmers would have some sort of a safety net. But they were paid on historical production. And also we introduced working lands conservation payments through the Conservation Security Program. Continued planting flexibility and a program of direct payments based on historical production. And it allowed for updating of historical base acres and adding historical soybean acres. But as you can see, there was a resistance to moving away from these historical support payments. You can just kind of tell from the language in these acts that they had been receiving these price supports and having the safety net, and it was an entitlement that they were unwilling to give up. And there's a good reason for them feeling that strongly. The farmers and the senators in the big farm states. Currently, farming has been much more profitable than it has typically been historically. I'm just looking at some numbers that are put together by the USDA Economic Research Service on average net returns. This is for Pacific Northwest wheat, and it is returns to risk. So it is covering all costs of production except for risk and management. And over this period of time, 1975 to 1997, it looks to me that we have more negative than positive returns. In 1975, there was a brief period of positive net returns. In the middle of the 80s, there was, and then just a tiny little spike around 1988. Other than that, they were basically eroding their equity on wheat farms on average in the U.S. Currently, the situation has been better than that, but you can see why farmers have some. There is a reason that we've had these price supports and trying to add some stability to the farm sector, because they basically are price takers. They don't have much control over the prices they have to pay, and they also don't have control over the markets. So if the world price is low, they have very little recourse. However, these farm program payments have allowed them to continue, because this does not include farm program payments, these graphs that we're looking at right now. So normally, without farm program payments, you would be forced to have a more diverse portfolio, perhaps move away from some of these commodities that are being supported with the farm programs. Okay, so for corn, it's not a whole lot different than it was for wheat. I'm sorry, I want to go back to corn for just a minute. You can see that the returns are by and large negative. The net returns to risk and management from 1975 to 1995 show just a bit of time when you have positive net returns. The rest of the time, they are not positive. And the reason that we see corn continuing is because we have farm program payments that have allowed them to survive despite negative returns. Now, livestock, as opposed to crops, are not supported with farm program payments. And if you'll notice the top of this graph, that is zero, the zero line. That was in the middle of the previous two graphs for crops. So cattle has not been a profitable enterprise. The way I read this is the more you raise, the more you lose. It's a tough way to make money to raise cattle, and other livestock has been problematic as well. And I think that by showing you these, I hope that it has given you a better understanding of why we've moved away from integrated crop and livestock production, in that there has been price supports for crops and not for livestock. However, there's other movements going on in terms of just the cost of machinery, that you have to get bigger and bigger in order to pay for your fixed costs, like combines and tractors that have been just increasingly expensive, increasingly efficient, but requiring larger and larger farms. and relatively inexpensive. Capital has been relatively inexpensive compared to labor. So we have fewer and fewer people running larger and larger farms with larger and larger tractors. So in response to these challenges, we have this increasing specialization, producing just one crop on average, increasing farm size, increasingly mechanized, and substituting less expensive capital for labor. And that's all we have, I believe. Jonathan now.
Okay. Thanks, Kate. So I think I'll just breeze through these quickly because I think we're running short on time. But I just wanted to introduce our current research project, which is located on the Palouse, just north of Pullman, Washington. It's dryland. We've got 20 to 22-inch precipitation each year, and typical crops in the area, very dominated by winter wheat, with spring wheat and legumes in the crop rotation. So we're really looking at the performance of a conventionally farmed ground compared to an integrated non-organic crop livestock farm compared to a fully certified organic crop livestock farm. And the key here is that in this area there's no good source of organic fertilizer. We don't have significant livestock, and we don't have feedlots nearby, and so it's very expensive to ship in organic fertilizers. So really our best option here is to grow our own nitrogen using legumes. And the purpose of this project is to see if we can improve the soil quality while also making sufficient economic returns by grazing green manures, so putting weight on animals while also getting all those nitrogen benefits in the crop rotation. So I will skip the details on these rotations. The key here is that in our organic treatment, we're hoping to supply all of the nitrogen needed for winter wheat using just green manure legume crops. And so in this project, we're really looking at the economic performance of these different crop rotations, how productive they are on a per area basis, and then looking at changes in soil quality and greenhouse gas emissions. So I'd like to just conclude this talk by sort of wrapping up what we talked about. So generally, mixed crop livestock farming is pretty small in the U.S. And Kate explained some of the big economic trends and the policies that are sort of at play that are encouraging specialization and the separation of crop and livestock enterprises. And so with research, we sort of see the role of research as overcoming some of the agronomic barriers to crop livestock management, but then maybe more significantly demonstrating the benefits of these sorts of systems so that in the long term we can start to shift the policy field towards policies that favor this sort of more diversified and maybe more ecologically sound farming practices. And so we're hoping in the next couple of years to be joining eOrganic to give a webinar on more specific results and management practices from the research that we're doing. So I wanted to just, I don't know if these made it on the posted PDF, but these are some brief materials, some studies on some of the things we've discussed, if anybody's interested in further reading. And with that, I think we can take questions.
We had a few questions about some of the statistics that Kate posted, particularly the numbers of farms. Those numbers were multiplied, should have been multiplied by 1,000. Is that correct? So in other words, there were 6. How many it said that it was 6,000 farms in 1900, but that should be multiplied by 1,000. Is that correct? Multiplied by 1,000. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, no, we just had a few
Yeah,
questions.
I got that is correct. 2 million farms. I apologize.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for catching that.
Okay. Yeah, it just seemed a little small to a few people there.
Yes.
So, yeah. Okay, so that clears that up. So let's see. I am having some echoing, so
I'll unmute.
I think that's through Kate. So maybe, but you'll probably have to come on again in a moment. So we'll see. I guess there were some questions also about the profitability of farms that came up when you had the slides of cattle farming and soybean and corn. And so does that mean that all farming is unproductive? Can you address that a little bit? Or I think he meant unprofitable. I think you're muted, so everyone's muted.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
A little slow on the trigger there. It's showing average over the whole country. So there are areas where wheat is more of a rotational crop. It's not the profitable crop. They may grow wheat between potato crops or something like that rotate out of another crop and into wheat. And there are other places in the country, like where we are right here in eastern Washington, northern Idaho, where wheat is the main crop. And so it is a lot more profitable, but we're averaging these. And I think the USDA does a good job. I think they're reliable numbers, but it's for the whole country.
Okay.
And it does reveal, though, how stagnant agriculture was for a very long period of time. And if you're when you're doing these kind of calculations, if you are at zero, if you're breaking even, you're covering all factors of production. You're not eroding any equity. You're paying your labor. You're paying for land. You're paying for your capital. Most farmers find ways to survive because of the inherent riskiness and just the way that there are bad years and good years. They find ways to cut corners. They put up with eroding equity at times in exchange for a lifestyle, being their own bosses, things like that. So it's complex, and there's a lot of information that I could give, but I think that's maybe enough. I'd be happy to answer more.
Okay. There's a question about why you use sheep and not cattle in the experiment.
Thanks. That's a very good question. So there's several factors here. Part of it is in targeting our weed control. So especially in the organic treatment, we're really not depending on any herbicides, of course, and we're trying to control our weeds completely using grazing and crop rotations. And sheep tend to be a lot better at broadleaf weed control, as well as grazing closer to the ground, whereas cattle will graze a little bit higher and will tend to favor grasses. And so because of this type of ground and because of the weed pressures that we're having, that's one reason for the sheep. There are two other reasons. One is there are some concerns with compaction using big animals like cattle. So if you're grazing too intensively with cattle or with any livestock, really, you have to be concerned about soil compaction. And then the other thing was just marketability. As far as direct sales go, it's much easier to sell a whole sheep than a whole cow. And in this case, we're using a breed called white Dorpers, which tend to be a smaller sheep, and so there again is a little easier to market. So an individual or a family can buy a whole sheep rather than it feeling too overwhelming as a purchase. Thanks.
Okay. Here's a question from a small certified organic farm in Michigan. It says, we want to add livestock to our crop rotation, utilizing the area that's not under production but in a cover crop. Our concern is the new food safety modernization bill. Unless I read it wrong, I won't be able to plant any fruit or vegetables for months, which means we can't graze any animals out there. Can someone please explain this to me, or if you have any suggestions? Let's see. Everyone's muted.
I will make
okay, there we
a
go.
small stab at it. This is Kate. I think a lot of people are really concerned about this new Food Safety Act, and I think there's going to be a period of time when there's going to have to be some adjustments and wrinkles kind of ironed out of it, because it is so restrictive in terms of interactions with livestock waste and food production. I mean, I think we had to start somewhere, but I know a lot of producers who are worried about similar things. So I think you're going to just have to maybe stay closely listening to that policy and how things work. It's still pretty brand new. And so good luck to you.
Okay, next question. Integration of livestock and cropping probably requires greater labor. Maybe livestock producers and crop growers could share forage. Hard to get crop growers to become livestock producers. Anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. It's absolutely, it can be very hard if you're a full-time crop farmer to then take on this whole other enterprise and infrastructure, and that's part of what Lynne was talking about with her different models of integration. Historically, there have been many cases where there's been a crop grower and an animal farmer who have just been closely tied, and they've used each other's resources as needed. So in this area, for example, in the Palouse, historically, there have been groups of sheep herders who have wintered their sheep down in the low grounds and then brought them up onto the plateau to graze stubble and help with weed control. And it's really an arrangement between the two. And so there's huge synergies that can happen when the two, even if they're managed by different people, are coupled like that.
Yeah, this is Lynn. I agree that can be a very useful model that one person owns the livestock, but they may be moving their livestock onto other people's land. But that organization is very relationship dependent. The livestock owner really needs to make sure that the landowners remain happy with that agreement, because the livestock owner basically has more to lose than the landowner does.
Okay. Here's a question about whether there are any restrictions or concerns producers might have in harvesting crops by livestock. I am particularly concerned about crop insurance restrictions that might apply to crops harvested by livestock after the crop has failed. Do you know of any restrictions? See, we can't hear you, so.
I do not know of any restrictions in those cases, but I'm not completely sure. Lynn,
I don't think there's any restrictions too.
No, there's nothing current. Kate, you might want to touch on the new Food Safety Act again, though. So there would be potential restrictions in an organic system. It shouldn't actually be a problem at this point. Depending on what crop you're growing, there's a 90 to 120 day interval that you must have between harvesting and applying raw manure to land in a certified organic system. But in a conventional system, there's currently no restriction like that, and there wouldn't be any problem. But Kate, do you know the timeline on this new act, and is it actually passed and formalized at this point, or it seems to me it's still in discussion and the period where people can have comments?
Yeah, I believe it's passed, and that it wouldn't surprise me though if we're going to have to make some changes. I'm not an expert on this. I know we're going to have some training at our extension meeting this winter on the implications of the Food Safety Act. But the question was, is there, if I'm remembering correctly, what you were saying from that came over the system was, is there any restrictions to grazing livestock on a field crop? And no, there wouldn't be any in a conventional system at all, unless it was a landlord situation where they didn't want that.
Okay, we did have a comment about the insurance, that there is a new cover crop termination policy that may impact crop insurance, so there may be some insurance implications. And then another comment was about the Food Safety Modernization Act, that it still is in the comment phase, and it's open until November 15th. So it's presently in the draft form, so that's good information. So if you'd like to submit a comment, you can still do so. Here's just a general question about why we need more integrative livestock crop systems. Oh, I want to take that. We don't hear you if you are speaking. Okay.
Jonathan, maybe you could touch back on some of the benefits. This is Lynn. There definitely are efficiencies to be gained in nutrient cycling and weed management. And it gives opportunity for the grower to have a vertically integrated system. So these systems, I mean, we had some tales of woe in this presentation, but it definitely can be an economically productive system too, because you can gain the profits from not only your crops, but from the weight gain of the livestock. But it really depends on, from what I've seen, it really depends on you having a good marketing system also, where your purchasers are willing to pay for your livestock having been raised on your farm, having been, basically happy animals, grass finished, etc.
And then to kind of add on to that, and more generally speaking, there are a few, I guess, themes maybe, not clearly stated in this talk, but so specifically having to do with organic management practices, bringing livestock into a crop rotation can really help with weed control. So it's a non-chemical weed control that is also non-tillage based. And so in this area, for example, erosion is a big concern, and so that really limits people from growing organic crops because we can't be using tillage for our weed control. So livestock can be a very can be an important tool in reducing or eliminating herbicide usage. And then also, to me, one of the real big benefits, generally speaking, of bringing livestock back into a crop rotation is to encourage cover crops, green manures, or even longer-term pasture phases in a crop rotation. Because without that, you'll have to sacrifice, really, if you're growing a green manure for nitrogen benefit as a farm, you would have to really sacrifice most of a growing season. And so if you're not getting revenue from that, that's a big hindrance to doing that. Whereas if you graze livestock, you can obtain some profit or revenue from the green manure while also obtaining most of the nitrogen benefits of that green manure, and also at the same time increasing your soil quality and reducing or eliminating your fertilizer inputs.
Okay, great. I just wanted to mention that we have a direct link to the PDF of the slides in the chat box now, and we also have a link to the FDA website for how to comment on the Food Safety Modernization Act. So we have a link to both of those right now posted in the chat box in case you want to check out those two links. Some people wanted to print the slides and the indirect link wasn't working, so I just posted the direct link there.
Could I just make one more comment on
Sure.
why we need more integration quickly? I'm sorry for interrupting. But this is Kate, and I think that one important reason that we've had this specialization and concentration on like one commodity is that you get a lot of production and marketing efficiencies from just concentrating on one commodity, because when you're one small farmer, you have to like join co-ops just to try to market your crop, but we do need to get a lot more efficient to meet the challenges of the food needs over the next several decades. So we have to be able to use our land in a more intensive fashion. We can do that if we integrate and maybe have two sets of owners, maybe one raising livestock, another raising the crops. We can gain a lot of efficiencies, but we do need to have, and I know we can do this, is just become more efficient in terms of coordinating and using our land better, and also marketing locally, and people want to have healthy animals that have been well taken care of for their protein sources, and I think that if it's very hard to market those and to make money on those in our current system, and we can also, I think, rise to that challenge. Thank you.
Okay. Do you see the opportunity to have incentives that fall between 0 and CRP rates for intensive managed grazing to encourage grazing, which seems to have a greater positive impact on the land?
Well, I'm going to say that would be a great idea. The problem, I think there is a huge number of folks that like to hunt on the CRP land. At least that someone told me that was, or they did not want to have grazing, and it would be very good for the land to have managed grazing, in my opinion, if we can get past some of whatever the policy barriers are with some sort of incentive like the caller mentioned.
Okay. We have a few more comments about the insurance, and that is that someone had said that something that might impact insurance is using grazing as a method of cover crop termination. So that was just a clarification of his earlier comment. And then another person said that his understanding of the new food safety regulations is that manure deposited by a grazing animal is considered unintended deposition, and like droppings from wild animals is not covered by the food safety regulations. So if you'd like to read more, read about the proposed regulations, you can check them out at that link and comment on them as well. Let's see. Can you please specifically define dryland in terms of average rainfall per year? Someone wanted to know.
Well, actually, you can't, because it depends. It depends on when you receive the rainfall and what type of wheat you're growing. So, in our most arid growing areas, like 10 inches of precipitation per year, they will grow winter wheat. Most of the rainfall is received in the wintertime, perhaps even in the form of snow. And but if it's a spring wheat crop, they're going to have to be in an area that gets more spring and summer rainfall. Otherwise, they won't have a good crop. But in general, I can sort of answer that. Around 10, 12 inches or more depending on the soil and when the rain falls, up to about 28 inches of annual precipitation. That kind of covers our eastern Washington, northern Idaho dryland wheat growing region. And then depending on where you fall in that spectrum, you may be able to grow crops every year. If not wheat, then some rotational crops, or you may have to only grow wheat every other year in like that 10, 12 inch, 14 inch rainfall zone, or in the middle, you may be growing crops 2 out of 3 years.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and that is about whether anyone has had experience using chickens on the floor of an orchard. See, anyone want to take that?
I've used geese for one season on the floor of an apple orchard, and that was on the East Coast. And I haven't used chickens. But this was in an established orchard, and I was quite happy with the results. And yeah, with all of the life on the orchard floor, we were able to produce a good flock of geese, and that was using a rotation of electronetting to rotate the geese.
Okay,
well, thank you. Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, can I just
sure.
Of course. It actually is hard to define, and people have different definitions. Part of it is the amount of rainfall, and when it comes, just Googling a little bit here, I'm finding that it can be, it's usually referring to less than 500 millimeters annually, but can be up to 750 millimeters, so up to even 30 inches of rainfall. But it also implies that you're not irrigating, that you're, for the most part, just dependent on the precipitation.
Okay, well, thanks. We are running out of time, but I'd like to thank everyone for submitting your questions and comments, and mention once again that you can find this and our many other recorded presentations on organic farming and research topics at the link on your screen. Thank you so much, Jonathan, Kate, and Lynn, for giving this presentation, and thank you all for joining us.